In this video lecture, we're going to talk about personal writing of the war, memoirs and letters primarily, but also poetry. Let's start by thinking about one of our letter writers. Lionel Sotheby was a young man from a well-to-do family. He attended Eton, the most prestigious school in Britain for boys in the public school phase of education, roughly age 11 through the end of high school. Like many patriotic Etonians who graduated from school near the start of the war, he enlisted in the Army as soon as he finished school, taking a commission as a second lieutenant in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, his uncle's regiment. Sotheby saw some of the worst fighting of the early part of the war. He was killed at the Battle of Loos in September 1915, age 20. Sotheby was a young man without much experience of the world. His life had been typical for a young man of his class. His memorial notice at Eton College noted that he was a footballer and rower, but said he was not distinguished at Eton as an athlete, nor had he more than average brains. It called him nothing special, but said that his war service had shown the depth of his faith and the intensity of his love for Eton and Eton's honor. After Sotheby's death, his parents gathered his letters and published them privately so they could be circulated among his family and friends. Later, his letters and diaries were donated to the archive at the University of Leeds. You can see from Sotheby's letter to his mother that he has agreed to write frankly to her about his experiences. He is telling her about the Battle of Aubers Ridge, and he expects that by the time she receives his letter, she will have read about it in the newspaper, so he doesn't hold anything back. He describes what happened, but is less forthcoming on his own feelings about all this. He holds to the British tradition of downplaying one's own emotions. When he does speak of his emotions, it is in a joking manner. "Well, lucky it wasn't my head," he says, when he discovers his cap is full of shrapnel holes. This is before steel helmets came in for the British Army. Toward the end, he tells his mother that, "I feel a changed person at present, and unable to laugh or smile at anything, feeling almost in a dream." Our next letter is from the war poet Wilfred Owen. He was killed in battle 1 week before the armistice that ended the war. In fact, the village bells were ringing to celebrate the end of the war when his mother received the telegram informing her of his death. Like Sotheby, Owen was very close to his mother and promised to tell her frankly what he was experiencing in the war. I've included this letter in our study because, in addition to telling a harrowing story of battle, it also shows readers how Owen was consciously crafting the letter with an eye to narrative. Look at the paragraph lengths in the letter. He uses occasional very short paragraphs, as well as occasional very short sentences, to stop readers and draw attention to the story he is conveying. When he writes, "I have not been at the front," as one complete paragraph, and "I have been in front of it," as another, we feel the shock and horror of the story he is about to tell, even though he hasn't used any emotive language or talked about his feelings at all. This letter was written before Owen began writing poetry about the war. At the time, he felt that poetry should be about nice things. Later in 1917, he developed shell shock after experiencing extreme trauma in the war. He was buried alive among other misadventures and was sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland for treatment. There he met Siegfried Sassoon, who befriended him and encouraged him to write poetry about the biggest experience either of them would ever have, the war itself. Owen's early poetry is very forgettable, but his war poetry made a name for him, mostly posthumously, since he published only a few poems before he died. So let's take a step back and just think about how letters work. In a time before texting, email, and being able to make a quick phone call from anywhere, letters were the primary means of communication between individuals. They are personal, a story that the writer tells to a specific audience who they know well. We do expect them to be at least somewhat informal. You can see that Owen's letter is written in pencil on cheap paper, with cross-outs and corrections. Although they are the first draft of a stable version of the story the writer is telling, they can be crafted, just like a poem or a work of fiction. Let's turn now to another form of personal writing, the memoir. Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War, is one of the best-loved World War I memoirs, mainly because of the quality of the writing, but also just because of the story Blunden tells. His regiment was positioned in some of the worst sectors of the British front, and he himself saw battle during the whole course of the war. Unluckily for him, he was never wounded, and as a result, he was with his unit pretty consistently, which is not true of every officer who survived the war. Many of them spent time in hospital recovering from wounds or illnesses, and such hospital stays always involved substantial home leave to make sure the soldier was fully recovered before returning to battle. This gave soldiers a break from the physical and emotional strains of the war and helped prevent shell shock. Blunden was a distinguished officer who entered the Army in the usual way as a second lieutenant and ended up a captain by the end of the war when he was only 20 years old. His commanding officers thought highly of him, and he was decorated for bravery during his service. In the excerpt from his memoir that you are reading this week, you will see an example of the blank affect that is so typical of Blunden. He is describing a horrific scene, a fellow soldier blown to smithereens, but he recounts it distantly, emotionlessly, merely opining that Cambrai was beginning to terrify. If we were psychiatrists, we would note that blank affect as a symptom of untreated shell shock. Blunden conveys his emotional wounds not through descriptions of his feelings, but through his blankness. Another memoir I'd like to highlight is Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone. Borden was born and raised in Chicago, but she married an Englishman and thus was living in England when the war broke out. Wanting to help the war effort, she used her inheritance to found a mobile surgical hospital that primarily treated Belgian and French soldiers. Her memoir does not follow the usual pattern of memoirs. It is autobiographical, but it uses poems, a play, short stories, and sketches to offer a variety of views of the war. Like Blunden, the trauma Borden experienced during the war comes out in restrained affect in her memoir. She has seen so much, so many terrible things, that she cannot process her emotions and thus shuts them down. So when we think about memoirs as a category of text, we know that they are also personal, but they are written for a public audience. The intention is to publish the memoir so that anyone may read it. World War I memoirs, for the most part, came out in a great wave starting about 10 years after the war was over, so they are not immediate renditions of experience, even though they may be accurate. Memoirists frequently use diaries and other devices to know where they were on a given day. Because memoirs come out so long after an important event, memoirists tend to know what people think about the event. The narrative is already set in place. Thus, we can see in the memoir excerpts we're reading for this week that there is already built in a sense that the war was a waste, filled with unnecessary suffering and unjustifiable loss. Our poet this week is Isaac Rosenberg. He is an interesting figure, in part because he is so different on so many fronts from other poets. He was trained in art before becoming a poet, having spent part of his youth apprenticed to an engraver. He came from a poor immigrant family that had fled the Tsar's Russia because of persecution, but he was the sort of fellow who picked up useful and important supporters. He was killed in battle in 1917. This image from a film taken as aid workers rushed to bandage and transport an injured soldier shows Rosenberg in a candid shot. He is the soldier in the front right of the photo. As you can see, Rosenberg was an enlisted soldier, not an officer. This reflects his class background. We should think about how life at the front would have been different for an enlisted man like Rosenberg compared to the life of an officer like Sassoon or Owen. When we think about poetry, the first thing we usually focus on is its craftedness. It doesn't always read like straightforward English. Sometimes sentences are inverted, or poets use archaic language, or, commonly, poems are filled with images that contribute to the meaning of the poem, but have to be examined in order to see the richness and complexity of the poem. We know that the poet has carefully chosen the words and images of the poem, and so we look at them carefully. Sometimes poems hide meanings behind what appears on the surface, especially if the poems are ironic, which of course we expect from modern poetry. There is a video lecture specifically walking you through Rosenberg's Returning We Hear the Larks, but let's talk about that poem here a bit too, as we consider it in the context of the memoirs and letters we've read this week. Rosenberg seems to be writing about an experience he really had, an experience of hearing larks singing in the early morning as he marched wearily back to his camp with his comrades. This poem creates a contrast between the somber night, the soldiers' condition — they barely have their lives as they walk a poison-blasted track toward a little safe sleep — and the beautiful sound of the lark singing. Readers feel the oppressive situation of the soldiers, then the sudden lightening of mood as they hear the beautiful song. Rosenberg is contrasting what the natural world does, create beauty and joy, with what people do, create the horrors of war. If you were writing a paper about the readings for this week, how might you connect the strategies Rosenberg uses here to the strategies you observed in the memoirs or letters? What do you think each genre can do best? How do memoirists and letter writers borrow from the practice of poets? Let's also take a quick look at break of day in the trenches. Because the opposing armies were so close together in their trenches on either side of no man's land, both armies had what the British called stand to at dawn and dusk each day. During this time, the most likely time for an attack, the soldiers would stand on the firing step of their trenches, facing the enemy, with weapons ready to repel an attack. Of course, most of the time, that attack didn't happen. The Great War was a remarkably static war in which most of the killing was done by artillery fired from afar. So it makes sense that stand to would be both nerve-wracking and boring. In this poem, a soldier during stand to has time to pull a puppy to place behind his ear, converse with a rat, and think about the condition and status of soldiers in the war. What is the mood of this poem? How does the soldier seem to feel about his fate?